Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
I stepped off the plane expecting the comfortable ache of relief that hits you when the world finally stops vibrating like a generator under your boots, when the air no longer smells like hot metal and powdered instant coffee. When you can drop the backpack that has been your pillow, closet, and therapist for what felt like a lifetime, and instead I was met by a text from my mother that said, in her favorite practiced optimism, that the whole family couldn't wait to see me, but dinner might be a little later than usual, because the kitchen was a whole situation, which was her code for chaos disguised as hospitality, and I laughed out loud in the arrivals lane because I knew that woman could braise beef with one hand while paying bills with the other. So if dinner was threatened, then something was off, tilted, not just the jet lag kind, but the kind that tells you the welcome home you pictured has already been edited by someone who doesn't care about continuity. By the time I reached my parents' house, the porch lights were on even though the sun hadn't fully surrendered, and there was a new wreath on the door that my mother would never buy because it looked like a bridal shower threw up on a fern. And I felt this needle of irritation because it was a small thing to feel displaced by the taste of your own front door. Yet, that is the way displacement works, not with sirens but with decorations, and when I knocked out of habit rather than using my key. My father opened with a smile that didn't quite reach both eyes, the left one lagging behind like a slow browser tab, and he wrapped me in his lumberyard hug and said I looked strong, which always means you look tired, but we are proud despite not knowing how to say it. And I told him strength is what you fake when you have no choice, which made him chuckle and blink away something that might have been a tear or just dust from the driveway. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and avoidance, and my mother rushed me like a cheerleader with a casserole, chattering about flight delays and traffic, and did the base handle your bags, and how is the weather over there? Every question tripping over the next before I could answer any of them, which is a classic stalling technique in my family, the conversational equivalent of throwing glitter in someone's eyes, and I let it happen because I have learned that truth shows up only after people run out of small talk. But then she said a sentence that landed like a dropped tray. She said, "At least you weren't here to see how close they got." And then she gave me the smile she uses when a toddler falls, but doesn't cry, and you try to sell the fall as a dance. And I looked at her hands and noticed the dish towel was twisted into a rope, which told me the real story. I asked who they were with a voice so even I could have sold it as calm, and my mother swallowed, said my wife had been spending a lot of time helping my brother with the house because he had projects. And I almost laughed because my brother has always had projects the way raccoons have midnight buffets. Everything he touches is half-finished and twice as expensive, and the fact that my wife, who color codes the socks, would volunteer to untangle his messes was a headline with no article. So I pressed, and my father cut in with that stern kind tone men use when they want to be gentle and decisive at the same time, saying family sticks together when one of us is gone. Which was beautifully noble and completely irrelevant to why my wife answered his text faster than she answered mine for the past few months. When she finally walked in, late, breathless, holding flowers she would hate to receive because they were supermarket blooms dying at the edges, she looked like a woman who had rehearsed sweetness in the car and forgotten the lines in the driveway. And when she leaned in to kiss my cheek, she missed by a degree and hit air, which is a small thing unless you have been measuring distance for months on a map and praying that home is the exact place where nothing misses by a degree, and I heard myself saying her name, and then my brother's name, slow, as if I needed to be sure the words still fit in my mouth, and she said my brother, and she had become close, because the nights were long and my parents needed help and the dog needed walking and grief has weird chores. And I thought, yes, grief does have weird chores, like folding someone's shirts when you aren't sure they're yours anymore. My brother appeared with that smirk he pretends is just an unfortunate resting face, and he called me soldier like he was auditioning for a show he didn't watch, and he hugged me with one arm while checking the room for witnesses with the other. And he said he kept everything steady while I was gone, which was a bold statement from a man who cannot keep a plant alive through one weekend. And I said thank you, because I was raised to be polite even when the ship is already taking on water, and then my mother chirped that we should eat before the casserole deflated, a thing casseroles do only in suburbia and family crises, and we all sat, and the chairs creaked like they were warning us. Halfway through my second bite, my mother launched into the speech you save for courtrooms and interventions, the one about how life is complicated and people make connections when they're lonely and the heart is a wild animal you do not leash without a fight. And I stared at the green beans and thought my mother had always loved metaphors right until they were about me, and I asked, with a voice that had to climb over a hill of rage to get out clean, whether connections meant what it usually means when people whisper it over wine, and the table went quiet except for the tiny clock over the stove that always runs a little fast like it knows we never arrive on time emotionally. And my wife put her hand on the table like she might reach for mine and then didn't, and my brother tore a piece of bread down the middle like a magic trick that produces nothing. And my father cleared his throat and said the thing that finally put the plate down in front of the train, for the sake of family. We're asking you to forgive them. I could have flipped the table, but I have learned there are rooms where flipping a table only gives the other diners something dramatic to point at while they keep eating, so instead I drank water and let the cold outline what I wasn't going to say. And I asked who decided forgiveness was due before an apology even showed up, and my mother said this isn't about blame, which is exactly what you say when it is about blame, but your favorite child is standing there, and my wife whispered my name. Like it might still be a key, and I remembered all the late calls that dropped and the photos that never arrived and the casual stories about errands that felt too coordinated, and I realized the welcome home I wasn't invited to had been happening here for months. Maybe longer, and I smiled the way you smile at a security camera because you want the footage to look good later. Truth would have been easier if it came with a receipt, but all I had was a wreath, a casserole, a missing kiss, and a speech about family values delivered like a coupon with an expiration date, and I set my fork down and told them I was tired. Which was true in the way a town is tired after a storm, and I stood up and said I needed a shower, which was also true because nothing washes off a long absence like hot water and silence, and as I moved down the hall I caught my brother's reflection in the glass, the kind a man makes when he believes he has secured a prize and only needs to manage the press release, and I thought, not for the first time, that sometimes the only way to keep your sanity is to play along until the lights are better and the microphones are on. I closed the bathroom door and leaned against the cool tile and finally let the tremor out of my hands, and over the hum of the vent I heard my mother say, with that soft force she uses to rearrange whole lives, that tomorrow we would all sit down and make a plan. Because families that plan together survive the scandal together, and my father murmured that love finds a way, and my wife said nothing at all, the quiet of someone who has finished her part and is waiting for the credits to roll. And I turned the water on and watched steam swallow the mirror until I couldn't see the woman everyone was so eager to manage, and I promised myself I would be generous with one thing only, and that was patience, the kind you need to let a trap look like a carpet. And as the house settled around me like a stage before the curtain rises, I realized I was the only one who hadn't given a speech, which was fine, because the one I was writing would not need applause, only witnesses, and if they wanted me to come home for the sake of family, they had no idea which home I was bringing with me, or how fast a wreath can become kindling when the match is ready. The next morning began with my mother's calendar voice announcing itself like a flight attendant who had mistaken our living room for a runway, cheerful and insistent about a family conversation at 11. As if pain could be scheduled between errands and a grocery pickup, and I stood in the doorway with coffee that tasted like burned hope while my parents rearranged chairs into a tidy semicircle, a formation usually reserved for holidays and apologies from other people, not this peculiar summit where I, the allegedly too dramatic returning spouse, had to be guided through the maze of forgiveness the way you walk an anxious dog past fireworks. And I watched my father line up coasters as if the symmetry of circles could neutralize the asymmetry of loyalty, and my mother fluffed pillows until the seams protested, narrating the way only she can. That love is a house with many rooms, and some of those rooms are messy during renovation, which would have been wise if we weren't talking about my marital bedroom temporarily repurposed as my brother's favorite project. When my wife arrived, she carried that nervous smile you practice in a parked car, the one designed to hold, at least for an hour, while people use phrases like, "We never meant to hurt you, and things just happened." And my brother followed 2 paces behind with his hands in his pockets and the casual slouch of a man who expects to be graded on a curve, and for a long minute no one sat, because sitting would give this scene a shape. So we hovered in our own weather systems until my mother clapped softly and told us to take our places like we were auditioning for reconciliation, and I took the far end of the sofa and ran a finger along a seam as if I could unzip the whole performance and climb out. My father opened with a speech that had both the cadence and the moral softness of a well-meaning sermon, full of metaphors about storms and anchors and the way loneliness can turn a kind person into an opportunist without them noticing. And he said my brother had taken on responsibilities while I was serving, which was a generous interpretation of replacing light bulbs and standing too close to my wife at the sink. And he said my mother had held everyone together and deserved our gratitude, which I did not argue because she had in fact managed to run a household, stage a romance, and write the script for my response simultaneously. And then he said the sentence that told me they had rehearsed this precise moment in low voices over laundry. "Forgiveness is not approval, it is a decision to move forward for the sake of family," and my mother nodded like a metronome. I asked what exactly we were moving forward toward, and could someone define family in this context, because mine seemed to have been remodeled while I was away, perhaps without permits. And my mother smiled in that tight way that signals a pivot and explained that my wife and my brother had found comfort in each other's company during a season when comfort was in short supply, and that while the timing was unfortunate, feelings are not a switch you can flip with a motivational poster. And my wife, to her credit or to her shame depending on the angle, said she had missed me, and then she had missed me in a different way, a more immediate way that turned loneliness into habit, and that she had not planned to fall for him. And my brother, hearing his cue, announced that he had never intended to take anything from me, but that love has a way of choosing, which would have played better if he had not said it like a man reciting a line he found under a bottle cap. I let silence expand, not out of saintliness, but because I learned overseas that silence is how you make people show their actual faces, and when the room finally needed air, I said that if we were going to assign meanings to noble words, we might as well use proper nouns and actual dates, because forgiveness without facts is just an eraser on a Sharpie, and I watched my mother's hands flutter toward the tray as if refilling water would drown the specificity out of me, and I told them I understood better than most that life gets complicated under pressure, that longing can dress itself as duty when you are tired and want a shortcut, but that complicated and dishonest are not synonyms, and that if they wanted my cooperation in this family theater, they would need to stop pretending the curtain was closed when I could see the stage hands. My wife looked at her knees, my brother looked at my wife, my father looked at my mother, and my mother looked at me, and in the tiny pause that followed her inhale I made my small move, the kind you can execute while still appearing docile, the type of revenge that doesn't break any laws but cracks a few veneers, and I asked them to open their phones because I wanted to show them something, and when my mother hesitated I said, with my best daughter voice, that I needed to borrow her group thread with the extended family because we were due for honesty, and while she fumbled I pulled up the photo folder I had synced from my wife's shared cloud months ago, a mundane collection of grocery lists and sunsets, yes, but also a receipt from a quiet little inn 2 towns over, dated midsummer, with a line item for a bottle of the specific wine my wife orders when she wants to celebrate and forget simultaneously. And I held it up like a postcard from a trip I hadn't taken. I typed in the family group thread a single line that would read as polite to anyone who didn't know how to parse a grenade dressed as etiquette, something along the lines of, "Since forgiveness is the goal, can we align on the month the relationship began so I know where to start?" And then I attached the receipt with no commentary and hit send, and the chime sounded around the room like a doorbell you cannot pretend not to hear. And my mother's eyes went wide in that way that means the neighbors will call with questions, and I added, still pleasant, that I had CC'd the church ladies committee because they keep the prayer list and I didn't want anyone praying for the wrong miracle. And then I put the phone down as gently as if it were a sleeping baby and folded my hands in my lap, because sometimes the lightest touch sets off the best fireworks. The replies began to arrive in a chorus, First the confused aunts, then the cousin who collects gossip like antiques, then the neighbor who never misses a bake sale. And as my mother tried to grab the phone back, I told her she could breathe, because we were all about truth today, weren't we? And my brother, suddenly pale, mumbled that I had no right to drag everyone into this. And I told him the moment he walked into my marriage, he dragged everyone in. He merely did it quietly, while I prefer proper lighting, and my father rubbed his forehead and said this was not the way, and I said maybe not for them, but for me, a woman who had once learned to make order from chaos with nothing but a checklist and a stubborn streak. This was exactly the way. I stood, thanked them for the seminar, and told my wife I'd be by the house later to pick up a few things that still belonged to me emotionally, even if the paperwork needed editing. And as I reached the door, my mother whispered that I had humiliated the family. And I said, almost kindly, that families cannot be humiliated by facts, only by the stories they tell to avoid them. And I walked to the porch with my coffee cooling in my hand and the text thread lighting up like a marquee behind me. And as the screen door side shut, I felt the first click of a domino, small but undeniable, because revenge, when you do it right, does not roar, it whispers into the right ear at the right time. And tomorrow, when they faced the fallout shaped like polite questions from people they cared about, they would discover that my silence had ended on my terms, and that the show was only beginning. I spent the next few days moving through the house like a careful observer of a stage set, noticing the way my brother left his shoes in a perfect line as if he were trying to prove some sense of control over a world that had never asked for his attention, and how my wife arranged the cushions just so, smoothing corners that were never truly smooth, pretending that appearances could patch over the gaps her choices had created, while my parents floated between rooms dispensing advice in hushed tones, each word a polite attempt to realign the moral compass of a family that had already lost direction, and I watched it all with a patience born of long deployments and long silences, understanding that the only way to pull back the curtain on their comfortable lives was to become part of the stage, invisible and observant, waiting for the perfect cue. I began with small, deliberate actions, subtle enough to appear incidental to anyone who was not paying attention, yet pointed in their effects, like dropping a suggestion in conversation that highlighted my brother's inconsistencies, or leaving a document out where my parents could see that he had not completed the financial responsibilities they praised him for, and I watched the way their faces tightened when they realized they were being confronted with truths they preferred to ignore. Truths wrapped in manners and civility so that they could not accuse me of malice, only of noticing, which is the kind of vengeance that gnaws quietly at the edges of a person's pride without them knowing the teeth have been sharpened. I invited my brother to help me with a project that he assumed would be mundane, a home improvement chore that required precision and follow-through, and I watched as he struggled, as his impatience grew, and as his carefully constructed confidence began to crack under the weight of my deliberate instructions and unwavering oversight, all the while maintaining the veneer of politeness. Because humiliation delivered without anger is like cold water on a fevered room, impossible to ignore and devastatingly effective, and my wife watched from the sidelines, unable to disguise the unease that flickered across her face as she realized that competence was not something my brother had ever possessed in abundance, and that my calm scrutiny was a mirror she could not look away from. In the evenings, I allowed myself small indulgences of reflection, replaying conversations and moments in my head, noting the inconsistencies, the half-truths, the delicate lies my family had woven around this affair as if fidelity were a costume to be worn and removed at convenience, and I began leaving traces of evidence in unexpected places. A note tucked into a book, a photo folder subtly renamed, a reference to a date that would catch them off guard, all designed to plant seeds of doubt and hesitation in their minds so that even in the most mundane moments, they would encounter reminders of the chaos they had attempted to normalize, and I observed the way suspicion began to ripple through the household like a slow, invisible current, barely perceptible but undeniable to those who were already attuned to the tremors of truth. I had learned overseas that patience is often more powerful than force, that the quietest movements can shift entire landscapes when executed with precision, and I applied that knowledge here with deliberate care, choosing my moments, timing my interventions, and allowing the natural patterns of their daily lives to carry my actions forward in ways they could not resist. And each day I watched them stumble slightly, a misplaced glance, a hesitant step, a quiet question whispered under breath. And I catalogued these small victories like a general noting the advance of his troops across a contested field. The most delicate part of my plan was balancing exposure with plausibility, allowing them to remain unaware of the full picture while I guided them to its edges, creating an environment where they could not trust their assumptions, where every glance at each other and every interaction with me carried an undercurrent of uncertainty, and I could see the subtle ways it changed their behavior. My brother's smugness tempered by hesitation, my wife's nervous attempts to appear unaffected, my parents' polite counsel tinged with caution, and in each of these movements I felt the slow building of momentum, the calm before the storm, knowing that when the moment finally arrived, the consequences would feel inevitable and inescapable, as if the world had tilted under its own weight rather than my deliberate orchestration. At night, I would sit in my room, listening to the quiet hum of the house, noting the shadows cast by the streetlights on the walls, considering the precise timing of my next moves, and rehearsing conversations that had not yet happened, all the while maintaining the appearance of someone returning to normal life, someone attempting to reconcile, someone who might forgive, because the best vengeance is always hidden behind the most convincing mask of civility, and I found satisfaction in the slow tightening of the threads I had set in motion, knowing that the perfect moment of revelation, humiliation, and clarity was approaching with the inevitability of nightfall, and that by the time it arrived, the family that had conspired against my trust would be forced to confront every quiet betrayal, every small deceit, and every misaligned assumption in ways they could no longer control, leaving them exposed and me finally in the position of calm, precise authority over the chaos they had chosen to ignore. By the time the weekend arrived, the subtle shifts in atmosphere had transformed the house into a tense theater of anticipation, every glance carrying weight, every conversation carrying double meanings, and as I watched them navigate this new reality, I knew the storm I had been cultivating would break not with thunder, but with the quiet, devastating inevitability of truth, and I smiled to myself in that private knowledge, understanding that patience, observation, and carefully administered consequences could accomplish what anger and confrontation never could, and that my moment of triumph, when it arrived, would be both precise and unforgettable. The day I chose to confront the consequences of months of careful observation arrived quietly, with the sun casting a pale, almost accusatory light through the living room windows. And I moved through the house with the deliberate calm of someone who knows every corner, every echo, and every expectation has already been measured and catalogued, understanding that my family had grown complacent in their illusions, relying on appearances, repetition, and polite narratives to shield themselves from the truth that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long, and I knew that subtlety had done its work and it was time for precision to take its place. The moment where calculated exposure could no longer be ignored or redirected without consequence. I invited the family to what I framed as a casual brunch, emphasizing a relaxed atmosphere and light conversation, yet every detail was chosen to maximize clarity and contrast. From the placement of chairs to the timing of the arrival of various relatives, each unaware participant becoming a witness to the exposure of truths they had chosen to overlook. And I could see the almost imperceptible shift in my parents' posture as they realized that their well-worn scripts for family harmony were being rewritten without their permission, while my brother attempted to maintain a casual air of competence that was already fraying under the careful orchestration of my actions, and my wife, though trying to appear neutral, betrayed her unease through subtle gestures. A bite of the lip, a hesitation in her voice, a glance that lingered too long at the wrong moment. As conversation began, I allowed the threads of daily life and past incidents to surface naturally, weaving observations into questions that appeared innocuous, but carried implications sharp enough to pierce the veil of comfort my brother had relied upon citing small inconsistencies in stories he had told, dates he had misremembered, and trivial financial errors he had assumed would remain invisible to anyone scrutinizing the pattern of behavior over time. And as I spoke, I maintained a tone so measured and reasonable that anyone listening could not accuse me of malice, only of attention to detail, and I watched the ripple of discomfort spread through the room, subtle but undeniable. As people began to understand that the foundation upon which they had built their casual reassurances was shaky at best and entirely false at worst. I produced evidence, small in appearance, but devastating in implication, photographs, messages, and receipts that documented moments carefully hidden, showing my brother's presence where he had claimed absence, my wife's involvement where she had feigned distance, and my parents' enabling gestures that, when viewed together, formed a narrative too consistent to dismiss. And as I laid each piece out on the table, the reactions unfolded precisely as I had predicted. From my mother's hand, clutching at her pearls in a half-hidden panic, to my father's sigh that tried to maintain dignity but faltered under scrutiny, to my brother's tightening jaw and fleeting, almost imperceptible glance at my wife, searching for solidarity that no longer existed, and in that room, the carefully maintained illusion of family unity began to dissolve, leaving only the raw architecture of choices and consequences. I allowed moments of silence to stretch long enough for the impact to sink in, knowing that the human mind fills empty spaces with its own assumptions, and as the room became thick with unspoken acknowledgement, I spoke once more, calmly, but with a weight that carried years of absence, sacrifice, and unacknowledged betrayal, explaining that forgiveness is not demanded by circumstance nor owed by tradition, and that the notion of family cannot excuse betrayal, neglect, or deliberate deception. And I could see the sudden, almost fearful recognition in the faces of those who had so confidently dictated moral terms without facing the evidence, realizing that the power of truth is amplified when it arrives in measured, undeniable increments rather than explosive confrontations that allow escape through anger or distraction. My brother tried to interject, to reclaim some sense of authority, but I anticipated every word, every inflection, and every rhetorical escape route, allowing him only the space that emphasized his complicity without creating opportunity for defense. While my wife, finally breaking her studied neutrality, whispered explanations that only reinforced the clarity of my observations, and my parents, caught between instinctive defense and the undeniable reality in front of them, could only offer faint protests, their carefully cultivated rhetoric of "for the sake of family" rendered nearly impotent by the weight of evidence that made it impossible to claim ignorance or innocence. As the brunch concluded, I stepped back and let the room breathe under the tension I had orchestrated, allowing the clarity of actions and choices to settle over them, leaving the house charged with the knowledge that nothing would ever feel the same. That the calculated patience, subtle exposure, and quiet orchestration had delivered a moment of reckoning that was both precise and inevitable, and as I gathered my things to leave, I glanced at my parents, my wife, and my brother, understanding that I had provided them a mirror they could not ignore, a reflection that held both discomfort and revelation, and as the door closed behind me, I felt the satisfaction of justice delivered without malice, the calm authority of a storm that had arrived silently, leaving the echoes of consequence to ripple through a family that would never again mistake appearances for truth. The house felt different when I returned the next morning, not because the furniture had changed or the sunlight cast a new pattern across the floors, but because the air itself carried the weight of revelations that could not be undone. A tension that hung like a fine mist over every surface, and as I moved through the rooms I noticed the subtle tremors of uncertainty in every gesture my family made, from my mother's careful rearrangement of objects as if proximity could restore the illusions she had once depended upon, to my father's hesitant steps that suggested a man uncertain how to inhabit the moral authority he had once assumed, to my brother's furtive glances and my wife's guarded expressions that betrayed the inner negotiations they were conducting silently, each person balancing pride, guilt, and fear against the backdrop of consequences I had delivered with deliberate precision. Knowing that the impact of truth often resonates long after the moment of revelation has passed, I settled at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had cooled just enough to taste like patience, allowing myself to observe without interference the ways in which my interventions had reshaped the family dynamic, noting how subtle shifts in posture, tone, and gaze had replaced the casual confidence they had previously wielded like armor, and I reflected on the strange power of restraint, how the quiet unfolding of consequences, rather than overt confrontation, can reveal character, motives, and weaknesses with an efficiency that mere anger could never achieve, while I traced the path of each individual's choices, cataloging the small betrayals, the enabling gestures, and the unspoken alliances that had allowed months of infidelity and complicity to proceed unchecked, all while preserving the outward appearances of normalcy until the precise moment when exposure could be delivered with absolute clarity. When my mother finally approached, her voice tempered and cautious, she asked if I felt any satisfaction in what had transpired, and I considered carefully. Knowing that satisfaction is rarely as simple as vindication and more often exists as the recognition that truth has its due, that accountability, even when uncomfortable, serves as the foundation for future interactions. And I told her that satisfaction is a quiet companion, not a public spectacle, and that the measure of its effectiveness is the clarity it leaves behind, which she seemed to understand, though her eyes still carried the weight of a woman grappling with the realization that her insistence on appearances had only delayed what was inevitable, and that the veneer of family unity she had so carefully curated could no longer obscure the fractures that truth had illuminated with surgical precision. I watched my brother attempt to resume routines, offering polite conversation and feigned ease, yet each word was undercut by the awareness that every action, every glance, and every gesture was being observed for discrepancies, and that his previous confidence, built on assumptions of my ignorance and compliance, had been irrevocably shaken by the subtle yet unavoidable exposure of his choices, while my wife, in her own careful manner, began to navigate the space with a renewed attentiveness. That suggested reflection, guilt, and a cautious reconsideration of the emotional architecture she had constructed during my absence, all set against a backdrop of parents who now weighed every statement with an understanding that the old narratives could no longer dictate the present or shield them from scrutiny. I moved through the day maintaining the appearance of routine, yet every interaction, every exchange, carried the implicit weight of judgment, observation, and consequence, and I noted the shifts that occurred in response to my presence, small tremors in posture, brief pauses before speech, subtle adjustments in tone, each one evidence of the internal reckoning I had set in motion, and in this way I observed not just the individuals, but the family as a system responding to the reintroduction of accountability, the subtle yet inexorable force that truth exerts when it is delivered with patience, precision, and an absence of overt malice, forcing recognition, self-reflection, and discomfort in ways that anger and confrontation alone rarely achieve. By evening, the house had settled into a fragile equilibrium, a space where civility remained possible but only under the shadow of awareness, and as I prepared to leave, gathering personal belongings with deliberate care, I recognized the quiet power I now held not through dominance, but through clarity, observation, and measured action, knowing that the echoes of the decisions, exposures, and revelations I had orchestrated would resonate long after I stepped beyond the threshold, influencing behaviors, recalibrating assumptions, and leaving a legacy of accountability in a household that had previously relied upon appearances, convenience, and selective memory. And as I closed the door behind me, the finality of distance allowed me a moment of reflection, a recognition that justice had been delivered, not in anger, not in spectacle, but in the deliberate, patient, and inescapable presentation of truth, leaving them to inhabit the consequences they had once chosen to ignore while I carried forward the quiet assurance that I had reclaimed both my voice and my authority, and that the story of betrayal, revelation, and resolution, though now paused, would reverberate through the fabric of the family for years to come, shaping choices, attitudes, and the fragile architecture of trust in ways only time would fully reveal.